The wind howled through the mountains like a dying beast, tearing across the valley and slamming against the wooden walls of the cabin. Snow hit the roof in thick, angry waves, and every gust made the old boards creak like bones under strain. Inside, Luke Carver sat alone by the fire, a tin cup of cold coffee resting in his hands. The flames threw shifting light across his face, a face worn by years of silence, loneliness, and memories he couldn't drink away. He hadn't spoken to another soul since autumn. The world beyond these four walls had taken everything from him: his wife, his boy, his purpose. Out here, the snow was kinder than people. It didn't lie, didn't promise, didn't break. It only covered things until they disappeared. Then it came. 3 knocks. Soft, hesitant, unbelievable. Luke froze. The wind should have been the only thing alive out there. He stood slowly, every muscle tightening, and reached for the rifle hanging by the door. Again 3 knocks. Weaker this time, but clear. Whoever it was, they were dying. He cracked the door open. The blizzard roared in instantly, clawing at his face, burning his skin with ice. In the swirling white stood 5 figures, small and trembling. At first he thought they were ghosts' shadows carved from snow. Then he saw the faces beneath the frost. 5 Apache women, barefoot, their clothes torn and soaked through, their eyes wide with the kind of fear that had forgotten words. The eldest stepped forward tall, proud even in ruin. Her lips were blue, her voice cracked. "Please," she whispered, "we need warmth." Luke hesitated. Every instinct screamed, no. He didn't have enough food. He didn't have enough strength. And yet he couldn't look away from the youngest girl, barely more than a child, collapsing into the snow, her hand reaching weakly toward the light spilling from his doorway. He lowered the rifle. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. The women stumbled past him, their bodies brushing his shoulders, their cold soaking through his shirt like needles. He slammed the door shut against the storm. For a moment, the only sound was the wild breathing of the living. Then Luke tossed more wood into the stove. The fire flared, painting the room gold and red. 5 strangers knelt before the flames, steam rising from their clothes. Luke stood behind them, silent, unsure if he'd just saved their lives or surrendered his own solitude. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, for the first time in 3 years, the cabin and the man within it began to breathe again. The door had barely closed when the storm hit harder, shaking the windows like fists of glass. Snow piled against the walls, sealing them in. Inside, the small cabin was heavy with breath. 5 strangers and 1 man, all caught between life and the howling dark. Luke Carver moved like a man in a dream. He threw another log into the stove, sparks flying, flames clawing up from the ashes. The light revealed what the storm had hidden. The 5 Apache girls were thin as ghosts, skin cracked from frost, eyes hollow but alive. Their hair hung in frozen ropes, their hands trembling too hard to hold anything. "Sit close," Luke said, his voice rough from disuse. The eldest Sahana guided the others nearer to the fire. Beside her, Naira, quiet and graceful, wrapped an arm around Loma, the youngest, who still shook violently despite the heat. Tiva and Maya huddled behind them, their gazes darting around the cabin, as if expecting someone to push them back into the cold. Luke went to the shelf, grabbed an old pot, and filled it with snow. When it melted, he added what little food he had left: beans, cornmeal, a scrap of salted meat. The smell filled the air, faint, humble, but full of life. He set the pot in front of them. "Eat," he said. For a moment, no one moved. Then Sahana whispered something in her own tongue, a prayer, maybe, or a warning, and the others began to eat in silence. Their hands shook so badly that spoons rattled against the tin bowls. Luke turned away, pretending not to see their hunger, their fear, their tears mixing with steam. He poured himself a cup of coffee, sat back, and watched the firelight play on the walls. It painted strange patterns, 5 shadows, swaying like spirits over the wooden planks. He thought of his wife for the first time in months, her laughter echoing through this same room, her hands kneading dough on that same table. The memory cut deep, sharp as winter air. When the pot was empty, he rose and fetched 2 thick blankets from his bed. Without a word, He draped one over Sahana and the other across Naira's shoulders. The women looked up, startled by the gesture. "You'll need rest," Luke muttered. "Fire won't last if you don't." Sahana's voice was hoarse but steady. "You didn't have to let us in." Luke met her eyes, the color of dark earth. "Maybe I didn't," he said quietly. "But I remember what it's like when nobody does." For a long time, neither spoke. The fire cracked and hissed, eating through the silence. Outside, the blizzard howled like a wounded world. Inside, 6 hearts beat to the same fragile rhythm, strangers bound together by one thing stronger than fear: the warmth of survival. By morning, the storm still hadn't passed. Snow pressed against the windows like a living thing, and the air inside had turned heavy with smoke and damp wool. Luke Carver woke to the sound of soft coughing near the fire. The youngest girl, Loma, was curled under the blankets, her face red and glistening with sweat. Her small body trembled violently. When Luke touched her forehead, the heat burned his hand. "She's burning up," he muttered. The eldest, Sahana, stirred from where she had been sitting against the wall. Her hair hung loose, her voice raw from the night before. "Please," she said, "let us stay until she gets better. Just a few days." Luke didn't answer. He turned toward the window. The snow had piled so high it buried the lower half of the fence. There was barely enough food for one man, let alone 6. Every instinct told him what he should do: send them away, before they took what little life he had left. But when he looked back, he saw Naira holding Loma's hand, whispering softly in Apache, tears catching the firelight. Maya sat nearby, trying to heat water in a small tin cup. Tiva rubbed her hands together, shivering but refusing to move from the sick girl's side. They weren't invaders. They weren't beggars. They were just lost. Luke set his jaw and picked up the kettle. "She needs warmth," he said, more to himself than to them. "Keep the fire high." He went to the corner, pulled an old trunk open, and found what was left of his winter medicine: crushed herbs, a flask of whiskey, and a half-empty jar of honey. He poured a little whiskey into a cup, stirred it with the herbs, and handed it to Sahana. "This might help her breathe." Sahana took it carefully, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you," she whispered. The words hit him harder than he expected. He hadn't heard "thank you" in years. As hours passed, the cabin became a quiet rhythm of care. Sahana kept Loma's head cool with wet cloths. Tiva and Maya melted snow for water. Naira murmured prayers in the Apache tongue, soft and melodic, filling the air with something that felt almost sacred. Luke tended the fire and watched them move 5 souls who refused to give up, even in the face of endless winter. By nightfall, Loma's breathing steadied. Her fever broke. She slept soundly for the first time since arriving. Sana sagged with relief, her eyes closing as she leaned back against the wall. Luke sat across from her, staring into the flickering flames. The storm still screamed outside, but inside, something far older and quieter had begun to rise: not desire, not pity, but compassion. He set his rifle back on its rack, then whispered into the crackling silence, "Stay." And for the first time in years, the word didn't feel like surrender. It felt like mercy. The third dawn came quietly, wrapped in pale gold. The storm had broken during the night, leaving behind a silence so deep it almost hummed. Luke Carver rose before the others, as he always did, but the cabin no longer felt empty. The air was warmer, touched by the faint sound of breathing, by the scent of wood smoke, and something sweeter: life. He stepped outside. The snow stretched in soft waves across the valley, the sky bruised purple at the edges of dawn. He filled his lungs with cold air, cleaner than anything he'd breathed in years. For the first time since his wife and son had died, he didn't feel the urge to curse the morning. He felt still. When he returned inside, the cabin was awake. Naira was stirring a pot of beans over the fire, humming under her breath in a low, rhythmic tone that reminded him of running water. Tiva sat cross-legged by the hearth, sewing one of his old shirts with neat, careful stitches. Maya was wiping the frost from the windows using a rag she had torn from her dress, her face lit by determination rather than fear. In the corner, Sahana was splitting kindling. The axe rose and fell with confident rhythm, every swing sharp and sure. Her strength surprised him, not just of body, but of will. When she paused to brush hair from her face, Luke caught himself watching her longer than he meant to. Loma, the youngest, was propped near the stove, bundled in blankets, her eyes open again. She smiled when she saw him, a tiny, fragile thing that hit Luke harder than any storm. "You're awake," he said, crouching beside her. "Feeling better?" She nodded weakly. "Warm," she whispered. Something in Luke's chest loosened. He looked around the room, 5 women moving quietly, purposefully, transforming his cabin into a home. He didn't know when that change had begun. Perhaps when he opened the door that night, or maybe when he said stay. But it was here now, undeniable. When Naira handed him a tin bowl of beans, steam rising into his beard, she said simply, "Eat. You need strength." He hesitated, almost out of habit. "You don't have to," she interrupted, her voice calm and certain. "We all help." The words landed gently, like truth. Luke sat down, ate beside them, and for a while, the sound of spoons against tin replaced the endless noise of the wind. As the sun climbed, melting the icicles from the eaves, Sahana began to hum a slow Apache song. The melody drifted through the cabin low, haunting, beautiful. Luke leaned back in his chair, listening. He didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He felt them. The fire crackled, the song carried, and for the first time in years, Luke Carver realized something simple and miraculous. The storm had ended. Not just outside, but inside him, too. The snow melted slowly that week, peeling away from the earth in thin, glistening sheets. Beneath it lay the first hints of brown soil and grass, the promise of spring hiding under the wreckage of winter. But inside the cabin, time seemed to move differently, soft, deliberate, full of quiet moments that carried more weight than words. Every morning began with the same rhythm. Naira hummed as she cooked, Tiva mended torn sleeves or boots, Maya swept the floorboards clean of ash, and little Loma, finally strong enough to walk, sat by the window tracing shapes in the fogged glass. Sahana, as always, worked beside Luke Carver fetching wood, checking the traps, or repairing the corral where the storm had broken the rails. She moved with quiet strength, her long hair tied back with a strip of leather, her hands rough and calloused yet graceful. Luke had grown used to their presence, though he would never admit it out loud. He no longer startled when he heard laughter, no longer looked toward the door expecting silence to follow. Something had shifted. The cabin didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like it belonged to all of them. That evening, the wind settled low, and the valley fell into the kind of stillness that only comes after a long fight with nature. Luke stoked the fire while Sahana sat opposite him, her face glowing gold in the flickering light. The others were gathered close, sipping from tin cups of hot broth. The flames cracked softly, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Naira's voice broke the silence. "Our tribe is gone," she said simply, her words falling like snow. "The soldiers came in the night. They burned everything." Luke looked up, his hand frozen mid-motion. Sahana didn't look at him. She stared into the fire, her voice low and raw. "They said we brought bad luck. My parents died in the fire. We ran, but the tribe cast us out. We walked for days. Then the storm came." Her tone was flat, not angry, not weeping, just tired, like someone who had run out of tears long ago. Loma's small hand reached for her sister's. Naira's eyes glistened, but she smiled faintly, as if trying to protect the others from her own grief. "When the snow fell, we thought it would be our grave. Then we saw your light." Luke's throat tightened. He didn't speak right away. The memories pressed against him, his wife's pale face in fever, his boys coughing that wouldn't stop, the grave he dug with frozen hands under the willow. Finally, he said quietly, "I lost them too. My wife, my son, 1 week apart." The air in the room changed softer, heavier. The fire popped, and Loma stirred in her blanket, whispering something that sounded like a prayer. Sahana looked at him for the first time, really looked. In her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Understanding without pity. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't need to. After a long silence, Luke leaned back, exhaling. "Pain doesn't mean we're cursed," he said, staring into the flames. "It just means we've survived something that tried to end us." Sahana nodded slowly. Then we are strong, she whispered. The others murmured in agreement, their voices blending softly, a chorus of survivors. The cabin filled with a fragile warmth deeper than fire, quieter than peace. Hours later, after everyone had drifted to sleep, Luke remained by the stove. The embers glowed faintly, breathing light into the shadows. He listened to the sound of steady breathing around him, the rhythm of life returning to a place once hollow. He realized he no longer heard ghosts in the silence. The laughter, the prayers, the whispers of those 5 women had chased them away. For the first time in years, Luke Carver closed his eyes, not in grief but in gratitude. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how long this fragile calm would last. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't alone anymore. Outside, the snow began to fall again, gentle this time, as if the sky itself was blessing what had survived below. And inside, around a fire that refused to die, 6 souls shared more than warmth. They shared sorrow, and with it, the beginning of hope. By the end of March, the sky began to shift again. What had once been soft snow turned into sharp, cutting wind. Clouds crawled over the mountains, gray and heavy, rolling low enough to touch. Luke Carver could smell it before he saw it, that metallic taste of air that meant trouble was coming. He stood on the porch, his coat snapping behind him, watching the horizon darken. Inside the cabin, the women moved with quiet purpose. They had learned to read his silences the way they once read the signs of the forest. Sahana stepped out beside him, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders. "It's coming," she said. Luke nodded. "Harder than the last one. We'll need to brace the barn before nightfall." Without waiting for him to ask, Naira, Tiva, and Maya began gathering rope, nails, and planks. Loma, still too small for hard work, stacked firewood by the stove. It was the kind of cooperation Luke had never known: wordless, natural, born from shared survival. By mid-afternoon, the wind had turned savage. Snow swirled like smoke, slashing across their faces as they fought to tie down the barn doors. Luke hammered the boards in place, while Sahana held them steady, her hands raw and bleeding from the cold. The sound of nails striking wood mixed with the roar of the blizzard, a rhythm of defiance. At one point, a gust tore a plank from Luke's grip, sending it spinning into the dark. He swore under his breath, his face burning from the cold. "Hold it steady," he shouted. "I am." Sahana yelled back, her voice nearly lost to the storm. Their eyes met through the snow, fierce, alive, unbroken. Together they pressed their shoulders to the door, fighting the wind as if it were something alive. Inside, Naira and Tiva were tying ropes across the ceiling beams to keep the roof from lifting. Maya stumbled in and out, clutching tools, her hair crusted white with frost. None of them hesitated. Every breath was pain, every movement an act of will, but they kept going. Finally, the last board fell into place. Luke slammed the final nail home, then staggered back, chest heaving. The barn held, barely. He turned to find Sahana half collapsed against the wall, her skin pale, her lips trembling from the cold. He reached for her without thinking. "Inside, now," he ordered. They fought their way through the snow, the wind trying to drag them back. When they stumbled through the cabin door, the sudden warmth hit like fire. Loma and Maya rushed to close it behind them, sealing out the white fury. Luke sank to his knees beside the stove, pulling off his gloves with shaking hands. His fingers were numb and cracked. Across from him, Sahana sat hunched by the fire, steam rising from her hair. Her cheeks were flushed red, her breath ragged. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I used to think I would die in the snow," she whispered. "But not now." Luke felt something twist inside his chest. Not pity, not desire, but a strange, powerful recognition. "You won't," he said softly. "Not while I'm here." The others gathered close. Naira wrapped Sahana in a blanket, while Tiva poured warm water into a tin cup. Loma leaned against Luke's arm, small and exhausted, her voice barely audible. "It's not so cold anymore." Luke glanced toward the window. The world outside was nothing but a blur of white and fury, yet the cabin glowed gold and alive. The fire crackled, the air hummed with quiet breathing, and the scent of wet wood filled the room. They had fought the storm together, 6 people bound not by blood but by choice. Hours passed. The wind screamed and clawed, but the walls held. Every time it howled, someone added wood to the fire. They took turns staying awake, watching the flames as if guarding something sacred. When dawn finally came, the world was buried in silence again, deep, heavy, and clean. Luke opened the door a crack. The barn still stood. The fences were bent but not broken. Sahana stepped beside him, her blanket trailing on the floor, her eyes glimmering in the cold light. "Every storm passes," she said quietly. Luke nodded, his breath rising in white curls. "You just have to keep the fire burning." Behind them, the cabin stirred the soft laughter of women, the clink of pots, the smell of coffee and wood smoke. The storm had tested them, and together, they had passed. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that looked untouched by time. The snow stretched endless and bright under the morning sun, a sea of white that shimmered with light. The wind was still, the air sharp but clean. For the first time in months, the valley seemed at peace, quiet, patient, alive. Luke Carver stood at the threshold of the cabin, boots sinking deep into the snow. The silence felt heavy, not like loneliness, but like reverence. Behind him, the crackle of fire mixed with the sound of life, the faint clatter of metal, the murmur of voices, and laughter soft as breath. He turned as Sahana stepped out to join him, wrapped in one of his wool coats that hung almost to her ankles. Her dark hair gleamed in the sun, strands of it lifting in the cold breeze. Her cheeks were flushed from the warmth inside, and her eyes steady, dark, alive met his with a calm he hadn't known in years. "I didn't think the sun would come again," she said quietly. Luke smiled faintly. "It always does. You just forget, after too long in the dark." They stood together, watching the light spill across the land. The fences bent under snow, the barn roof glimmered with frost, and smoke curled up from the chimney proof that they'd endured. For a moment, Luke forgot everything else. The ache in his shoulders, the years of silence, the pain buried too deep to name. Inside, Naira stirred a pot of coffee, her humming soft and steady. Tiva swept the floor, her movements light, almost graceful. Maya was coaxing the fire, and Loma, small but strong again, sat on a stool feeding bits of wood to the flames. The air was warm with the smell of beans and smoke, the kind of scent that makes a place feel like home. Luke watched them through the open door. It was still hard for him to believe how quickly his world had changed, how a cabin that once echoed with ghosts now rang with laughter. He thought of the night he'd opened the door and let them in, and how close he'd come to turning them away. Sahana followed his gaze. "You've given us more than shelter," she said. He shook his head. "No, you gave this back to me." She looked at him then, a long, searching look that said more than either could speak. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of things neither dared to name. Later, after breakfast, they all went outside. The air was bright and cold, the snow crunching underfoot as they shoveled a path to the barn. The horses whinnied softly when they approached, nervous, hungry, alive. Luke handed tools to Sahana, who took them with a firm nod. They worked side by side, clearing snow from the roof, mending loose boards, checking the feed. Their breaths came in steady clouds, rising and vanishing in the sunlight. When Sahana slipped on a patch of ice, Luke caught her by the waist. For a second, neither moved. Her hands rested lightly against his chest. His fingers lingered at her side. The world around them was silent except for their breathing. Then she laughed soft, startled, like something half forgotten. "I'm all right," she said. "I know," he replied, voice lower than he meant. But he didn't let go right away. When they finished, the barn stood firm again, a little crooked but strong like all of them. They returned to the cabin as dusk fell, the snow glowing blue beneath the fading sky. The fire was already burning, the windows lit from within, warm and golden against the vast cold outside. That night, they ate together around the same table, beans, bread, and boiled potatoes, simple but enough. Naira told a story about her childhood, and Tiva teased Maya about falling asleep by the fire. Loma giggled, her laugh high and pure. Luke listened, smiling quietly, a soundless gratitude filling his chest. When the laughter faded and the fire burned low, Sahana spoke softly. "Every storm passes," she said, her eyes fixed on the flames. Luke nodded. "Then we keep the fire burning." Her gaze lifted to meet his. There was no fear in her face now, no distance, just warmth, the same kind that had once been lost to him. Outside, the snow glowed faintly beneath a silver moon. Inside, 6 souls sat close to the fire, bound together not by fate or blood, but by the simple act of surviving and choosing to stay. That night, Luke Carver didn't dream of loss. He dreamed of laughter, of firelight, and of the sound of a woman's voice saying, "The sun always comes again." By early April, the valley had changed color. The snow was gone, leaving behind dark, wet soil and the faint green of returning life. Meltwater streamed down the slopes, filling the creeks again. For the first time in years, Luke Carver's land smelled of promised damp earth, pine, and wood smoke. He had started repairing the fences and tilling what little ground he could save. Sahana worked beside him every day, her sleeves rolled up, her hands blistered but steady. Naira tended the fire and the meals, Tiva looked after the horses, Maya gathered herbs along the riverbank, and Loma ran between them, carrying water and laughter. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter from the world. It was the world. Then, one morning, the sound of hooves shattered that peace. Luke straightened slowly, wiping sweat from his brow. A column of riders approached from the east 10, maybe 12, kicking up a trail of dust where the thawed ground had hardened again. Even from a distance, he recognized the man at the front, Mayor Hollis, flanked by 2 deputies and half a dozen townsmen. The women saw them too. Naira's hand tightened around the edge of the doorway. Tiva reached for the younger girls and pulled them close. Sahana stood still, her eyes narrowing as the riders came closer. The horses stopped at the gate. Hollis dismounted, his heavy boots sinking into the mud. "Morning, Carver?" he called, his tone too polite to be friendly. "You've got company." Luke rested one hand on the fence. "I can see that." Hollis scanned the scene, the mended barn, the tilled field, the 5 women standing near the cabin. His mouth twisted into something between disbelief and disgust. "So the rumors were true. You're keeping Apache women here." Luke's jaw tightened. "I'm not keeping anyone. They live here." The mayor snorted. "They don't belong here, Carver. You know the law. Pine Creek's got no place for their kind." Luke said nothing. The wind carried the faint smell of rain. Behind him, the girls stood silent, motionless as shadows. Hollis took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're a decent man, Luke. Folks respect you. But this," he gestured toward the cabin, "this is bad for business. The army still patrols these parts. If word gets out you're sheltering savages, it'll be trouble for all of us." Luke looked him straight in the eye. "They're not savages, they're survivors." One of the townsmen spat into the dirt. "Survivors don't belong on white land." Something hot flared behind Luke's ribs. He pushed open the gate, walking until he stood face to face with the mayor. "This isn't white land," he said quietly. "It's mine. Paid for, worked by, and now protected by the people you're trying to chase off." Hollis's expression hardened. "You'd throw away your place in town for them?" Luke didn't hesitate. "If they go, I go." The men shifted uneasily, their rifles glinting in the sunday. The silence between them stretched long and thin. Then the mayor exhaled, the fight in his eyes dimming just enough to sound practical again. "All right," he said at last. "You want to play family? Then prove it. Pine Creek feeds its own, not idlers. You've got one season to make this place worth something. Grow crops, raise stock, show results. If the land thrives, they stay. If not," his gaze swept the women, "they leave." Sahana stepped forward. "And if the land thrives?" Hollis looked at her, startled by the steadiness in her voice. "Then you'll have earned your right to exist here." He swung onto his horse, gave a curt nod, and rode off. The others followed, leaving churned mud and a cloud of dust behind them. When the sound of hooves faded, the valley was silent again. Sahana turned to Luke, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and pride. "Why did you say that? You didn't have to stand for us." Luke looked toward the horizon, his face calm, his voice rough. "No one's running from here again. Not them. Not me." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Around them, the others slowly relaxed, the weight of the moment settling into quiet resolve. Luke looked over his land, still broken, still scarred, but alive. "We've got one season," he said, half to himself. "Let's make it count." The sun dipped behind the ridges, painting the valley gold. Naira struck a match, lighting the stove inside. The smoke rose straight and clean into the evening sky, a thin line of defiance against the coming dark. The town could test them. The world could doubt them. But from that night on, the Carver cabin would burn with one promise: they would not be driven away again. Spring came slow to Pine Creek Valley, cautious and tender. The frost retreated from the soil inch by inch, and the streams began to murmur again beneath the thaw. The challenge from Mayor Hollis hung over them like a shadow one season to prove they belonged. For Luke Carver and the 5 Apache women, that meant dawn to dusk labor. Each morning began before sunrise. Naira grinding corn, Tiva harnessing the horses, Maya fetching water from the creek, Loma gathering twigs for the fire, and Sahana always Sahana out beside Luke in the fields before the first light touched the hills. The land was cruel, stubborn as an old wound. The soil cracked beneath the shovel, refusing to yield. Luke taught them how to read the earth, how to plant deep, how to trust the rhythm of their own hands. The women, quick learners, worked harder than any hired men he'd ever known. Together they built furrows, turned soil, patched roofs, and reset the fence line. At night, when the day's sweat dried to salt on their skin, they sat around the table sharing what little they had. The meals were simple beans, bread, and laughter, the kind that healed slowly, like scar tissue. One evening, as the sun sank low over the fields, Luke found Sayana kneeling by the garden bed, her hands buried in the earth. She was humming softly in her own tongue. He watched in silence for a while, then crouched beside her. "You talk to the soil?" he asked. She smiled faintly without looking up. "It listens better than most men." Luke chuckled. "Then it'll do fine here." When she looked at him, the last light of the day reflected in her eyes gold, strong, alive. For a moment, the silence between them was full of warmth and something unspoken. Weeks passed. Shoots broke through the ground, green and fragile. The barn filled with hay again, and the chickens clucked lazily near the door. For the first time since winter, Luke dared to believe they might make it. But it wasn't the crops or fences that changed the most, it was them. The fear had faded from the women's eyes, replaced by purpose. Loma's laughter came easily now. Naira sang while she cooked. Maya braided flowers into Tiva's hair. And Sahana, she carried herself like a woman who had remembered what strength felt like. Luke often caught himself watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice. She always did. By midsummer, the fields glowed with life. Corn rose tall, beans clung to their poles, and the horses stood fat and calm in the pasture. Luke stood in the center of it all one evening, the warm wind brushing his face, and felt a quiet pride swell in his chest. They had done it together, not as charity, not as survival, but as family. Whatever judgment Pine Creek brought, he knew one thing for certain: they had already proved themselves to the only thing that mattered: the land itself. The summer sun burned bright over Pine Creek Valley, turning the fields into rivers of gold. The corn rose high, beans tangled along the fences, and the once dead earth now breathed again. Luke Carver stood at the gate, sweat streaking his brow, but his heart light for the first time in years. Around him, laughter drifted from the cabin, not the laughter of strangers, but of family. Naira hummed while stirring a pot of stew. Tiva and Maya carried baskets filled with corn, their hands stained by work, and Sunday Loma chased a chicken through the grass, squealing with joy. Sahana worked quietly beside Luke, gathering the last sheaves of grain. Their fingers brushed, and he didn't pull away. Then came the sound of hooves. A cloud of dust rose from the ridge, the riders from Pine Creek. The air turned still. Luke wiped his hands on his shirt and stepped forward. Mayor Hollis dismounted, eyes scanning the land. "You did it," he said finally, almost grudgingly. Luke met his gaze. "We did." The mayor looked again at the barn, the crops, the women. After a long silence, he nodded. "Then they stay." Sahana's breath caught. She turned to Luke, eyes glimmering. So we can live now? Luke smiled faintly. Not just live, live together. That evening, they shared their first meal grown by their own hands. The fire glowed, laughter filled the air, and the valley echoed with the quiet truth of their triumph. They hadn't just tamed the land, they had healed it. And in doing so, it had healed them too. Autumn came softly to Pine Creek Valley. The fields, once green and wild, now shimmered in copper and gold. The harvest was done, the barns were full, and the wind carried the scent of wood, smoke, and life, not survival, but peace. Inside the cabin, Luke Carver sat by the fire, watching its slow, steady dance. Around him, the five Apache women moved with quiet grace, Naira mending a blanket, Tiva and Maya laughing softly as they shelled beans, Loma humming by the window, and Sahana kneeling beside the fire, her eyes warm in the glow. Hard to believe a year ago this place was nothing but silence, Luke murmured. Sahana smiled. It was never silence, Luke. It was waiting for us. He nodded slowly, realizing she was right. The storm, the hunger, the loneliness, all of it had been leading to this. Not victory, not perfection, just belonging. When the fire crackled, Luke tossed in another log and said quietly, "Every storm ends, but only if someone keeps the fire burning." Outside, the stars stretched endless above the valley. The cabin's windows glowed like lanterns against the night, proof that love and courage had outlasted the cold. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in second chances, in kindness stronger than fear, then stay with us here, in the heart of the frontier. Subscribe to our channel, Wild West Love Stories, and join us around the fire for more tales of hope, courage, and love born from the dust. Because out here, under the same wide sky, every heart deserves a place to come home.